It is my pleasure to introduce A.J. Lowik, who will be speaking about creating trans-inclusive abortion services, challenging the gendered silos of reproductive health care. A.J. is a PhD candidate in the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality and Social Justice at UBC, the University of British Columbia. Their dissertation research considers trans people's reproductive decision-making processes and building on their MA thesis, which focused on access to abortion and trans people's inclusion into women-only spaces. So please join me in welcoming A.J. Lowik.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Erin as well for that land acknowledgement. I also want to acknowledge that from Vancouver, I currently work and live on the unceded stolen lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Indigenous peoples. This is important for me not only to identify myself as an uninvited white settler on these lands, but also because the way that we think about sex, gender, reproduction, and parenting are kind of caught up in this ongoing colonial project. And so we're talking today about trans people, but a lot of these issues, a lot of reproductive justice issues are also Indigenous issues as well. I wear many hats. So I'm a PhD candidate, as Erin has said. In my role as a PhD candidate, I also wear many hats. So I'm kind of part social scientist, where I conduct qualitative research with trans people on a variety of reproductive health issues. And then I also am a kind of more critical theorist. So today I'm going to be talking less about the critical theory piece, but for those who might speak this language, I could frame my research as the ontological choreography of gendered becomings, which is a kind of headsy way of talking about the way that people negotiate and navigate their gendered and reproductive identities within institutions, laws, technologies, and things like that. I'm a graduate academic assistant at the BC Centre on Substance Use. Substance use has some connections to the reproductive world. So, for example, thinking about pregnancy and alcohol interventions, for example. I'm currently editing a book that I'm very excited about with Demeter Press on highlighting non-binary experiences of reproduction and parenting. I do all kinds of freelance trans-inclusive training, and I just finished my first semester ever teaching. I had the privilege of teaching Intro to Trans Studies at UBC. My cat wants you to know that another hat that I wear is a cat parent. She rudely interrupted my little photo shoot. The plan today is to talk through kind of 9 stages or steps along my pathway with this topic, how it is that I came to this work, what it is that I have been learning in doing this work, and kind of situating my work within the broader landscape of this topic. So we're kind of going to move through my personal journey with this particular topic. So to start, I invite you to think back to 2007, so we're about 12 years ago. I was finishing an undergraduate degree. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, with my kind of academic future, but I was working at a women's only abortion clinic, and I found the work incredibly rewarding. The clinic that I worked at delivered both surgical and medical abortion services, as well as birth control counseling, pregnancy options counseling, STI treatments and tests, all kinds of reproductive services were delivered within this women's only abortion clinic. And I loved the work. I was also doing clinic defense at the time, so I was defending my own clinic as well as others in the community, and I found a lot of joy out of this work. I was also at the time questioning my own gender. I didn't have the language yet that I do now, and so I wasn't identifying as non-binary, which is how I identify now, but I knew that this category of woman wasn't entirely a good fit for me. I didn't know where I would end up, but I knew woman felt like a box I wasn't too comfortable in. At the same time, one of my colleagues came out as a trans man and indicated that he planned to medically transition, that he would be changing his name and using he pronouns. And ultimately that meant that the board of directors, the executive director where I worked, needed to figure out what to do with this employee. They needed to reconcile their women's only employment policy with the presence of a trans person in the workplace. Ultimately, what the clinic decided was that a woman's identity was required for employment, and this colleague of mine was let go from his position. I was allowed to stay. I hadn't kind of indicated a masculine identity. I hadn't kind of come out in any way that would jeopardize my employment. But nevertheless, it got me thinking, what would it look like for a trans person to receive abortion services within our clinic? What were the barriers to that care? So I started asking these questions, and I started kind of looking around the clinic and thinking, well, what would it look like? What would it look like if someone came here who was transmasculine or non-binary, someone who identified as a man, who was bearded, who, presented in a masculine way? What would that look like, particularly because this was a women's only space? So I incredibly informally questioned my colleagues. I kind of surveyed, without knowing that that's what I was doing, 8 of my staff members, and I asked them 3 questions. I asked them, have you ever served trans people? I asked them, do you feel competent or able to serve trans people? And I asked them, how do you think your practice would change if a trans person was your client? And I also at the time looked through every issue of gynecological and obstetrics academic journals that I could find to see if there was anything written there, and I found nothing. And so I kind of had all of these questions, and I had no way to kind of grapple with the questions that I was having. There was nothing out there that had been written on this topic. So I strung together the beginnings of these questions, the beginnings of this survey data, I suppose, the fact that I was finding nothing in the literature on this topic, and very loosely tied together a presentation that I presented at CPATH in 2010. And it was essentially just an exploratory question where I was saying, this is a thing that I think we need to think about. Can we think about this collectively? Interestingly, I was able to find one resource that came out of the Emma Goldman clinic in Iowa, which is a feminist reproductive health space. And at the time, what they were advertising was that they were open to all women, including trans women. And I thought, that's incredible that this reproductive health space is willing to serve the needs of trans women. But do they actually know what that means? Are they actually able to serve the reproductive health needs of trans women, some of whom might have penises, some of whom might need prostate exams? Is that actually what they're doing? Or is there some kind of linguistic confusion happening here? And so I presented this to my audience, and someone fed back to me, well, maybe what they mean is trans men, but they're just doing that thing that people do where they call trans men trans women and they call trans women trans men, and maybe that's what's happening here. And I thought, if that is what's happening, well, then that's not trans inclusion. That's, they're trying and the effort is appreciated, but would I trust a space with my healthcare needs if they were actually calling me by the wrong label to begin with? So at the time, that's all there was. There was me with my questions. There were my staff members who were telling me, some of them with 30 years experience in reproductive healthcare, that they had never seen an abortion client as a trans person, that was not within their frame of reference, and that they felt incredibly ill-equipped to serve trans people's reproductive health needs. Many told me that names and pronouns were the extent of how their practice would change, that as long as they used the proper names and pronouns, that otherwise how they delivered abortion care would remain the same. And I thought that can't be all that there is to it. So I decided to become an academic. I pursued a master's degree, and I focused on this question of what trans-inclusive abortion could look like, what the barriers were to it. So I pursued my master's in sociology at York University. And as part of that research, I conducted 2 focus groups and 8 follow-up interviews with abortion providers, as well as a variety of folks working in other aspects of kind of reproductive or parenting life. So midwives, trans health researchers, and a few folks who were working in transgender parenting programming. So focusing on kind of facilitating access to parenthood for trans people. And I brought them all together in 2 focus groups, and I let them talk to each other. I had very few questions. I was just interested in having them have a dialogue with one another where they could fill in each other's gaps, ask each other questions about the work that they were doing. I do not ever suggest transcribing focus group data. That was a chore, but I did it. And ultimately what I found was that there were 3 kind of categories of barriers when it came to creating trans-inclusive abortion spaces. And I'd like to talk through each of those 3 categories of barriers with you. The first barriers were what Greta Bauer and others call informational erasure. So this was the fact that people working in abortion settings didn't even know that trans people could be their clients. One quality advisor in particular who had been working in abortion for 25 years, it didn't occur to her that trans people would be using their body in sexual or reproductive ways. That's not how she understood transness to be. And so the fact that a trans person might need an abortion was an aha moment for her. These are not exact quotes from my participants, but kind of paraphrasing the themes that I found. So the "wait, trans people need abortions" was something that I was getting a lot from people working in this field. And then I was also having people tell me that they just didn't have the competencies. They didn't know how to provide trans people with service. They didn't know how their service provision would change or what it would look like. And then I had a lot of people asking me, well, where's the peer-reviewed scholarly literature on this topic? Where are the articles that I can read that will tell me how to do this work? And there were, at the time, none. And then coming from the kind of parenting midwifery focus, people were telling me, well, our work is about facilitating trans people's access to parenthood. We don't do abortion here. We do surrogacy and adoption and assisted reproductive technologies and access to kind of legal parenting rights. And we don't talk about abortion. And so there was kind of a very big disconnect between folks doing reproductive justice work and abortion work who weren't thinking about trans people, and then people who were doing trans parenting activisms who weren't talking about abortion. And so my master's kind of helped facilitate those conversations and actually helped facilitate some kind of community networks where clinics were able to make connections with folks doing primary care for trans people, and then suddenly they had a place where they could potentially refer their clients. So that was quite interesting. So that informational erasure was a major barrier. And then in our discussions, we identified dozens of operational and logistical barriers. So on the ground, doing the work of performing abortions, providing service to folks, what are the barriers to that when it comes to trans folks? And so things like the clinic and hospitals branding, the fact that many of these places have women in their title or on their website have a variety of images showing women of various races and ages, and that was kind of, the womanness was coded into the branding of many of these spaces. There were issues with booking appointments, so we'll talk about this a little bit later. There were issues with security policies, so abortion as a highly securitized space often depends on you having an identity document that matches you, because we only want the people we know and expect to come into the abortion clinic, so you're expected to produce a piece of ID that accurately reflects who you are. There were issues with billing, where if you have an M on your health card, the billing system in that province will reject your request to have an abortion funded because only people with Fs can have an abortion billed. So there were kind of issues with that. There were issues with forms. Well, how do we ask people if they have a legal name and then a name that they use, and if they use pronouns, and what if our consent form uses gendered language and it's a legal document? So there were all these questions about forms and documents. The language of body parts came up. How do we talk to our clients about penis and vagina sex if they don't use the words penis and vagina to refer to their bodies? What do we do? Questions about performing physical exams. What does it look like to perform a transvaginal ultrasound on a trans body? Questions about privacy and confidentiality. Do we isolate trans people for the sake of their own privacy? And then also other clients' responses. People were very concerned about, well, what if my other clients are upset by the presence of a trans person? What do we do? How do we negotiate that? So there were a lot of operational and logistical barriers, and when I do trainings with abortion providers, which is something I'll talk about a bit further, we focus a lot of our training here. So I talk through, well, what does a client appointment look like from beginning to end, and what the barriers might be, and how can we change your policies and practices, the language you use, so that trans people can navigate an appointment. And then a kind of more philosophical or political barrier that came up a lot in my research was around these policies of women's only space, women-centered space, and employment policies. So you'll recall that the place that I was working ultimately decided that a woman's identity was required as a condition of employment. And I thought, well, that seems to be an employment policy and a clinical operational policy at odds. If I can be your client, should I not also be your colleague? Yes, of course, we need to include trans women into women's spaces. That's, to me, not a question. But what happens if we exclude trans men, trans masculine folks, non-binary people, so that we can keep a kind of women's only or women-centered frame? But in the case of reproductive health, we actually need to be including trans men, trans masculine people, and non-binary people into our spaces because we're serving their bodies and they might have abortion needs. So this was a huge barrier, and for a lot of the folks that I interview and a lot of folks that I train now, this is the biggest hurdle. Talking about, how you book an appointment on the phone is easy. talking about the kind of feminist philosophies that underpin abortion provision is actually quite difficult and quite contentious, and a very salient conversation right now, in particular with things that are happening in Vancouver with our rape crisis and sexual assault intervention spaces. Ultimately, I found that there were three, and we're going to get a little bit theoretical, that there were three kind of normativities at play and at work in this work. The first one was cis-normativity, which perhaps you are familiar with, which is essentially just the assumption that there are two sexes, that there are two genders, and that they ought to correspond. So this is the way that cisgender people are framed as the default, as the norm, and trans people are the exception to the rule. This also rubs up against Repre Normativity, which is the way in which female-assigned bodies and women's identities in particular are maternalized. If you have ever tried to seek out a tubal ligation or a hysterectomy, you will know that the state, the medical establishment, your parents, your friends, strangers, are incredibly invested in making sure women retain their reproductive capacities. And this is something that we call Repre Normativity. And when you're a trans person, if you're a female assigned, your use of your reproductive body tends to tell people things about you that may not necessarily be true. So if you're a trans guy and you get pregnant, Repre Normativity comes out when people say, oh, well, he must actually be a woman, because he's engaging in this quintessentially female experience that is pregnancy. And so that's kind of a repronormative narrative. And then transnormativity, which is something that I have thought a lot about, but actually didn't have a word for until recently. And so when we think about trans people, when we think about kind of the meta-narrative of trans that circulates in popular culture, that circulates in our legal systems, we think of trans people as binary, as trans women and trans men. Very infrequently do non-binary experiences come up. And we also think about transness as a highly medicalized process. So hormones and surgery are what people do in pursuit of an authentic gender expression. And that is, of course, true for a lot of people. It's just not the whole picture. And so if we think about how cis-normativity, repronormativity, and transnormativity all kind of mess up together, that's what's at stake when we talk about trans-inclusive abortion, is how we have sexed bodies that have reproductive capacities that are linked to our concepts of gender at this kind of macro political, cultural level. And even who we think trans people to be or how trans people ought to relate to their sex bodies and reproductive capacities is kind of all messed up together. I'm going to skip this slide. Ultimately, what we end up with is, and what's kind of the platform here that I'm questioning, is these gendered silos of reproductive health care. So we have women's health, we have women's hospitals, we have women's only clinics, and these are places where we deal with things like pregnancy, menstruation, menopause, lactation, nursing. And then conversely, we have men's health spaces that deal with things like sperm mobility, infertility, as a of the kind of penis having person. And so interestingly, in the way that we deliver reproductive health care, we confuse and we conflate sex and gender. So would a trans woman be able to access the reproductive health care or other health care that she needs in a women's space? Or would she actually need to go into the men's space in order to access that? And would a trans man who was pregnant be able to access maternity care, which is itself a gendered word, in a men's health space? He's a man. Or would he have to go into the women's space? And so when we think about these kind of silos of healthcare and how we deliver reproductive healthcare in women's spaces and in men's spaces, trans people complicate that. They invite us to think about these silos in different ways and maybe ultimately disable the silos altogether. If we want our men's spaces to also be able to serve the needs of trans men, and if we want our women's spaces to also be able to serve the needs of trans women, well, then why do we need two silos that are delivering exactly the same healthcare? Can we just not dismantle the gendered system altogether? And ultimately, what this gets us into is a conversation about trans feminisms. So this is quite simply the intersection between transness and feminisms. And oftentimes when we think about trans feminisms, we think about trans women, and we ought to. We need to focus on how and when to include trans women into women's space. Incredibly worthwhile and valuable conversation that we need to be having. One of the kind of theorists who talks about trans feminisms initially started to do this theorizing around trans women, focused exclusively on trans women. And eventually what she kind of came to was that that was insufficient, that that frame was too narrow, that we need to also think about non-binary people, transmasculine people, trans men, and men within our feminist spaces. How can we serve all kinds of people as opposed to just women-identified people? And this is really important when it comes to abortion care. Abortion care is care of the body, and there are some men who need abortion services. And so what happens when we're delivering abortion within a women's only space and then a trans man needs access? So ultimately that's kind of what I'm grappling with. At the time that I was doing this thinking, this was one of the only policy manuals available. This was produced in 2002, and it's a trans inclusion policy manual for women's organizations. So folks at the abortion clinic where I was working, this was one of the tools that they had available to them to think about trans inclusion. Unfortunately, this manual talks almost exclusively about including trans women into women's space and doesn't kind of acknowledge the possibility that there might also be trans men who have physical body-based needs that would require them to access a women's only space. And so this tool, this manual, did great work in terms of providing resources for folks to think about trans women's inclusion into women's space, but didn't say very much about the case that I was interested in, the case of the abortion clinic. Flash forward, I had stopped thinking about abortion. I was starting to think about my PhD. I moved to Vancouver, was pursuing my PhD, was thinking about reproduction as a kind of larger issue. Abortion was still a piece, of course. Abortion was always in the back of my mind, but I was thinking more generally about reproductive life. And then out of the blue, I received an email from someone at La Fédération du Québec pour le planning des naissances, which is Planned Parenthood in Quebec. And they said, when we type trans and inclusion and abortion into a search engine, your name comes up. Do you have any resources for us? Do you have any tools, anything that you can tell us, scholarly literature, policy manuals? Do you have anything that we can use? And I said, no, there's nothing really out there. Flash forward about 6 months and they said, I don't know how, we got some funding. Will you write us a resource? And so somehow they mustered some money together and they asked me to write a resource. And so in the next year, I wrote this manual, which is the Trans Inclusion Abortion Services Manual. It's available in English and in French. It's been adapted for use in every Canadian province and territory except for Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and Manitoba. And that's only because I couldn't find a sponsoring organization or agency within those spaces. But there's a British Columbia version that talks about abortion in the British Columbian context. There's a PEI version. And so what I tried to do with this manual was take everything that I had learned in my master's, everything that I had learned working in the clinic, everything that I had learned from talking to trans people, and try to distill it into a manual that would help people figure out how to do this thing called trans inclusion within an abortion space. Here's a quick peek inside. So that manual includes a section on language. There's a glossary of terms, what terms you should avoid, what terms you should use with confidence. There's a section on asking questions and making mistakes, and people really like this section because folks are really concerned about doing it wrong and what happens if they do it wrong. There's Mythbusters Trans Reproduction Edition, where I dispel some myths and share some facts about trans people's reproductive lives. And then there's this section number 5, which is about actually operationalizing trans inclusivity. What does that look like on the ground? Part of that is this trans inclusiveness assessment. And essentially what it is a tool that allows a variety of people working in abortion settings, whether they're a frontline counselor or whether they're the physician working in the back or whether they're on a board of directors, to think about their own clinical space and think through how and where and whether they need trans-inclusive policies, what might barriers be, and to kind of assess their readiness to provide services to trans people. And then the other thing that this resource manual has is fictionalized scenarios as teaching tools. This is something I do a lot in my trans-inclusive training, is create a fake person, put that fake person into a scenario where things go wrong, and then ask people to reflect on what might be changed in order to make things go right. So I'd like to read through one of the 6 scenarios from that manual. So the scenario is, Michael takes an at-home pregnancy test after his period is late and finds that he is unexpectedly pregnant. He turns to the internet to find information on abortion services, and every clinic's website assumes that the client is a woman, and some are actually women's only spaces. Since Michael doesn't identify as a woman, he decides against the women's only clinic and picks another to call for an appointment. The person who answers the phone is polite, but almost immediately asks to speak to the client herself, and could she please come to the phone. Michael tries to explain that he's a trans man, that he needs an abortion. The person on the other end doesn't seem to understand. He needs to explain that he was assigned female at birth, that his provincial health card will list him as Michelle, list his sex as female, but that he is Michael, that he is man, and that he needs an abortion. Eventually, he is able to book an appointment. The obstacles in this case are that Michael doesn't see himself reflected in the imagery or the wording of any of the clinic's websites. And he makes a medical decision based on where he assumes he will be most welcome and most understood. He also wants to respect women's only space, and so he opts out of a women's only clinic, which is not an option for some people. Some people in their community, the only option is women only or women-centered space. The person answering the phone is prompted by a male-sounding voice to ask for the client herself, and Michael needs to explain and justify his need for an appointment by disclosing his genital status, his gender identity, and potential discrepancies between his identity and the information on his health insurance documents. This may not be information that he is comfortable disclosing to a stranger on a phone who is not yet his medical practitioner. He has no confidence in the trans-specific cultural competence of the clinic, and he needs their particular medical competence, so he is willing to keep the appointment anyway. And what's interesting is that many abortion clinics and many abortion providers expect to speak to the client themselves. And this is a security issue. This is a kind of pro-choice issue. They don't want, Jane's husband calling and saying, my wife needs an abortion. They want to speak to the person for whom the appointment is for. But oftentimes the policy is if you hear a man's voice, then you need to ask to speak to the client herself, which creates an obstacle for Michael because, of course, Michael is the client himself. And so the kind of language of booking an appointment is a barrier from the very beginning. The manual then includes a list of recommendations. You've considered the scenario, you've considered the obstacles. What are some recommendations to rectify that? And so I suggest things like including language on websites and brochures and manuals to say that we provide service to anyone who's experiencing an unwanted pregnancy. And that language of anyone, that gender-neutral language of anyone who's experiencing, will signal to trans folks that they're anticipated, that you've thought that they might be in your space. Again, we've talked about the kind of male voice and the issues around that. So I advocate that folks ask, am I speaking to the person for whom this appointment is for, as opposed to assuming that a male voice couldn't possibly be the person seeking the appointment. And that then ultimately staff need to be trained on how to respond if a person on the phone does disclose that they are trans. And it would be helpful, for example, to have spaces on intake forms that allow someone to jot down their pronouns or if they use a name different than their legal name. So this is just one of the fictionalized scenarios that I use as a teaching tool, but in the manual there are a variety of these scenarios, and they talk through the kind of logistics of providing abortion care to trans people. What was incredible to me was that after I wrote this manual, I heard from the National Abortion Federation. And if you don't know, the National Abortion Federation is the body that kind of creates the standards of care for abortion in Canada and the United States. They have NAF members, so these are clinics or hospitals that are affiliated with the National Abortion Federation, and the NAF goes and does audits of those spaces to whether that space meets the NAF set kind of standards of care. And they said, well, we'd love a trans piece here. We're not currently assessing clinics on their trans competencies. Can you help us? And so last September, I was the keynote speaker at the National Abortion Federation regional meeting in Toronto, and I was able to share this work with a group of abortion providers, which was phenomenal. Interestingly, I've also been invited back to the clinic, or I was invited back to the clinic where I worked 12 years ago, And that clinic continues to have a women's only employment policy, although now they do a lot of the operational things that I've suggested in my manual and in my training. So on the ground, they say that they're serving the needs of trans men, but interestingly, they've decided to continue to be a place that only employs women, which is not a decision I have made, but that's ultimately where they have ended up. So facilitating training is now a big part of what I do. I actually have one upcoming with some Vancouver-based abortion providers, and I use this manual to kind of back up the in-person training that I do. I was sharing this work in October of last year at a conference called Abortion Beyond Bounds, and I went to talk specifically about trans-inclusive abortion. But what was interesting to me was that the entire point of this conference was talking about expanding abortion, taking abortion out of the hands of certain clinicians in certain freestanding clinics, taking abortion out of hospitals, and thinking about, well, what would happen if a primary care physician was trained in abortion? What would that look like? What would that do for access within this country? What about midwives? Would midwives be good people, would be well positioned to provide abortion care to people? What would that look like? What about abortion doulas? So these are folks who kind of emotionally support people through the abortion process. What if we allowed abortion doulas to have access to the medications for medication abortion, for example? And what about self-managed abortion, which is often a very taboo topic, which is people taking abortion into their own hands, buying medications offline and taking them in the privacy of their own homes without institutionalized medical establishments overseeing that. What would that look like? And so this conference was really informative to me because I went to share what I knew, and ultimately what I got back was a really expanded understanding of abortion and the possibilities of providing abortion care to folks outside of clinics and hospitals. And I thought what incredible potential this has for trans people. That we can, yes, work to change the institutions that currently provide abortion care. We can work to make freestanding clinics and hospitals more trans-inclusive spaces, but we can also provide trans people with the option of going to their primary care physician, who might already be trans-competent and trans-trained, and providing an access to an abortion in that space. And that, yeah, self-managed abortion has incredible potential for trans people. That if I can order medications offline and have a medication abortion in the privacy of my own home, I never need to interact with medical establishments. I never need to risk being misgendered or experiencing discrimination or violence within an abortion space. So I've been doing a lot of interesting thinking about that. The National Abortion Federation invited me back. They invited me to create an American-specific version of the manual, which was incredible. So now there's a US version of this manual. I had to take a lot of things out because of the political climate of abortion in the United States. You can't talk about self-managed abortion, for example, so I had to kind of strip some of those things away from the manual. But ultimately, this launched 3 days ago, is an online learning module for all NAF members. That actually allows you to have an American Medical Association PRA credit, so a continuing medical education credit, so you can get credit for taking this course. And I created an online version, an interactive version of the fictionalized scenarios that are included in the manual. So people can kind of click through and decide, well, how would I respond to that scenario, and what would be the impact of that decision down the line of this person's care? And so I'm very excited that I've been able to create this tool, and that the National Abortion Federation, which is such a huge organization, with such huge kind of power within the abortion world, is invested in this conversation. So that's been the trajectory of my career with this topic, of the work that I do with this topic. And as you'll recall, when I started this, there was nothing. There were tiny little bits of information and ideas that I was stringing together with string and hoping would be something. Whereas the landscape now is quite incredible. So there's people writing articles in feminist news mediums, but also in all kinds of online news forums about trans-inclusive abortion. There are people shouting their abortions. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Shout Your Abortion movement, but it's essentially people trying to take away the stigma from abortion access and saying, well, no, like, abortion actually served me well. It was a life-affirming decision. It was difficult, yes, but it was a healthcare choice that I needed to make. And there are trans people shouting their abortions. Interestingly, the book that I'm co-editing is going to have a chapter on the Argentinian system. Right now, Argentina is thinking about the legalization of abortion, and trans people are caught up in that discussion in really interesting ways. So there's a chapter of my book that's going to be about that. There are folks who are hosting trans feminist conferences and panels. This is Joss Trudy, who said, "Stop saying and stop thinking that abortion is a women's issue. That makes such a difference because it's not just women that have abortions. Trans men have abortions, genderqueer people have abortions, two-spirit people have abortions." And so here's a person taking the opportunity to talk about trans people's abortion access within a trans feminist conference. And as a result of her words, here's yet another article that actually references her panel and says, "Oh, I saw this interesting panel and now I'm thinking about abortion in different ways." There are policy or practices like this We Testify, which again is like shouting your abortion, that include the stories of trans people, which has never happened before. There are infographics being made by various community organizers that talk about trans-inclusive abortion. There's things like the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, which has included trans-inclusive and gender-neutral language within their mission statement, which is incredible. But there's also things like the case of Ireland. So Ireland right now is again in this kind of discussion about the legalization of abortion. And in a decision that I don't necessarily understand, they decided to explicitly leave trans men out of the abortion law. They know that trans men and non-binary people need abortions, but they've decided not to reference them within the new abortion law. And the justification for this is it is believed that it could open the risk of transgender people losing other rights that they may be entitled to under other laws. And I don't really get that. I don't really understand that justification, but nevertheless, that's what's happening in Ireland right now. And then I am so thrilled that in 2018, Contraception magazine published 2 peer-reviewed scholarly academic articles about trans people's views on abortion and access to contraception, including abortion. And this just simply didn't exist. So the kind of groundwork that I've been laying and the kind of thinking that I've been doing, I'm so thrilled to see that people are now kind of talking about this. So abortion is a thing that I love. It's a thing that I am incredibly passionate about. But ultimately, abortion is one piece of trans people's reproductive lives. So if we expand the frame a little bit to conclude, we need to remember that trans people's reproductive lives across the board, not just abortion, but all facets of reproductive life, are incredibly understudied. We don't know very much about this. We don't ask trans people about their reproductive desires, including desired infertility. A lot of trans people do not want to be reproductive, and that's fine too, but we just don't talk about it. Across the board, service providers are simply unprepared to meet the reproductive health needs of trans people, including desired infertility. So abortion providers, midwives, people working in maternity wards, people working in fertility clinics and sperm banks just aren't prepared to deal with trans people. And then we need to remember that trans people's reproductive lives historically and today are subject to eugenics strategies. So if we think about eugenics as both encouraging some people to reproduce and putting policies in place that encourage and facilitate reproduction for some, but that also discourage, prohibit, or restrict reproduction for others. I've done work in this area around surgical and sterilization requirements as a condition of legal gender recognition. So if the state says, well, if you want an M on your health card, that's fine, but you need to permanently give up your ability to reproduce like a woman. Well, that's cis-normativity, Repre Normativity, and trans normativity all wrapped up in one. And that's eugenics, ultimately. And we need to recognize that as technology advances, as we get things like uterine transplants, that there are going to be ongoing medical, philosophical, ethical, legal questions about who should access them, what that should look like. And then ultimately, the ways that we think about sex, gender, reproduction, and parenting are part of and caught up in colonization, in institutionalized Western medicine, in racist capitalism, in heteropatriarchy, in cis-normativity. So it may seem as though trans people's access to abortion is this tiny, tiny fraction of an issue that it doesn't really impact that many people, and perhaps that's true. But if we think about that within the broader picture, trans people's reproductive lives are kind of rich for theoretical consideration, are incredibly salient when it comes to doing qualitative research. We need to simply start asking trans people about reproductive life, about reproductive desires. And that's something that I am thrilled to be a part of in my academic career and in my activist career as well. Thank you very much for listening. I welcome any questions, comments, queries, funny remarks. I welcome expansion of my knowledge on this topic, so if you have something to contribute, please. And thank you so much for listening.